Every airplane you fly was tested first. Test pilots take it up and push it toward the edge on purpose, flying it too slow, shutting down its engines, finding the limits so that you never have to. It is one of the most dangerous jobs in aviation, and sometimes the very act of proving an airplane is safe becomes the thing that destroys it. These are the tests that went too far. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe to Terra Obscura. Every crash until now has been mostly about an airplane. This one is about something stranger and newer, a machine built to carry ordinary people not just through the sky, but out of it. By the early 2000s, a handful of wealthy dreamers had decided that space should no longer belong only to governments and astronauts. They would sell tickets to the edge of space itself at $250,000 a seat. The vehicle meant to take those tourists there was called SpaceShipTwo, and on a clear morning over the California desert, its test program ran headlong into the same hard truth that runs through every chapter here. The line between testing a machine and being destroyed by it is thinner than anyone wants to believe. SpaceShipTwo was a beautiful and clever idea. It would be carried high into the sky beneath a giant mothership, then dropped and lit, its rocket motor flinging it upward toward the black edge of the atmosphere. To come home, it used a trick its designers were proud of. The whole tail could fold upward, like the feathers of a shuttlecock, turning the sleek spaceship into a draggy shape that would settle gently back into the thicker air below. They called this folding the feather, and it was the heart of what made the craft safe to bring home. But the feather carried a hidden danger, and it lived in the timing. During the violent rocket climb, the tail had to stay locked down. If it were unlocked too soon, while the ship was punching through the speed of sound, the raging forces of the air could rip it loose and tear the whole vehicle apart. The designers knew this. The trouble is that they treated it as something a pilot would simply never get wrong. There was a single lever to unlock the feather, and nothing physical to stop a pilot from pulling it at the wrong moment. The only thing standing between a routine flight and total destruction was a human being remembering one instruction perfectly, under pressure, every single time. On the 31st of October, 2014, two test pilots took SpaceShipTwo up for its fourth powered flight. In the left seat was Peter Siebold, the chief test pilot and director of flight operations for Scaled Composites, the company that built the craft. Beside him in the right seat sat Michael Alsbury, an engineer and veteran test pilot with 15 years of experience, a man his colleagues described as steady, gifted, and impossible to rattle. He had flown SpaceShipTwo before. As the rocket lit and the ship surged upward and shook violently around them, Alsbury was working through his tasks from memory, against the clock, his body battered by vibration and forces he had not felt in months. He was supposed to unlock the feather at a precise speed, fast enough that the air could no longer harm it. Instead, perhaps rushed, perhaps overwhelmed by the sheer assault of the climb, he reached for the lever and pulled it seconds too early, while the ship was still tearing through the sound barrier at less than the speed it needed. He never even commanded the tail to fold. He only unlocked it. But that was enough. The fierce transonic air seized the unlocked tail and forced it upward on its own, and the spaceship met a wall of stress it was never built to survive. Just a few seconds after the feather came unlocked, SpaceShipTwo came apart in the sky 9 miles above the desert. Michael Alsbury was killed instantly. He was 39 years old. What happened to Peter Siebold is almost beyond belief. As the craft disintegrated around him at nearly the speed of sound, he was thrown clear, still strapped into his seat. Somewhere in that violent tumble through the thin, freezing air, he managed to unbuckle himself from the seat and his parachute opened automatically. He fell for miles and lived, landing with a shattered shoulder but alive, the sole survivor of a spacecraft that had torn itself to pieces around him. When investigators studied the wreckage and the data, they reached a conclusion that should sound familiar by now. The fatal mistake had been made by a man, but the accident had been built by a company. The makers of SpaceShipTwo had known for years that unlocking the feather too early would be catastrophic. They had noted it once, in an email and a slide, and then moved on. They never warned the pilots clearly, never trained against it, and never installed the one simple thing that would have made the disaster impossible, a lock that would refuse to release the feather until the ship was going fast enough to be safe. They had built a machine in which a single slip of one hand, in one tense moment, meant death. The fix, when it finally arrived, was almost insultingly simple. The next SpaceShipTwo was fitted with an automatic interlock that would not let the feather unlock at the wrong speed, no matter what a pilot did with the lever. The safeguard that could have saved Michael Alsbury's life was added only after that life was already gone. At the frontier of flight, the rockets are new, but the dangers are old. The promise of carrying tourists to space was sold as something glamorous and almost easy, just around the corner. The reality is that conquering a new frontier is brutally unforgiving, and the rules paid for in blood over a century of aviation do not stop applying, simply because the machine now points at the stars. SpaceShipTwo was undone not by the mysteries of space, but by a single human hand moving one lever a few seconds too soon, in a craft that was never built to forgive it. The act of proving a machine is safe remains one of the most dangerous things human beings ever attempt, and the only honest way to do it is to respect, every single time, exactly how easily it can kill. The airplane in question is the Hawker, a small British business jet that has carried executives across the world for 60 years. After heavy maintenance, a Hawker must be flown high into clear air and deliberately pushed to the edge of a stall, in order to prove that the work has not changed the way it behaves at that edge. The point of the test is to confirm the airplane is safe. The grim truth is that the test has become one of the most dangerous things a Hawker pilot can do. To understand why, you have to look at a pair of tiny components buried in the wing. Like most fast jets, the Hawker has wings that sweep back toward the tips. Such wings tend to stall at the tips first, right where the controls that manage roll are located. To prevent this, the Hawker carries small devices called stall triggers, set into the leading edge of each wing. They are tuned at the factory to make the airplane stall in a safe and predictable order. They are adjusted once with great care, and then never touched again. But they sit inside the same panels that hold the wing's anti-icing system, so whenever that system is opened up for inspection, the triggers can be disturbed without anyone noticing. And once they have been disturbed, the only way to know whether the airplane will still stall safely is to take it up and stall it on purpose. For decades, a single ambiguous line in the maintenance manual governed who was allowed to do this. It said only that the pilot should be familiar with the stall characteristics of the Hawker. It did not require special training. So over the years, airlines and charter companies simply assigned their ordinary line pilots, men who flew passengers from city to city, and had perhaps performed one such test years before. They were not trained for what a Hawker can do at the edge of a stall, because that behavior is too dangerous to practice in a real airplane, and the simulators they trained in could not reproduce it. When the real thing went wrong, it would catch them completely by surprise. The first of these crashes came in February of 2024, on a gray morning of falling sleet over the high desert of western Colorado. A Hawker 900 had just finished a major inspection, and 2 pilots were sent to fly at home, performing the required stall test on the way. The captain was a deeply experienced aviator with more than 15,000 hours, and a resume most pilots could only dream of. A man who had helped design stall recovery training for one of the world's great plane makers. If anyone could handle this, it was him. But the weather was poor, with thick cloud and icing reported across their path. For reasons that died with them, they climbed away with the wing anti-icing system switched off. As the jet rose through the clouds, a thin film of ice began to form on its wings. That ice was invisible, and it was deadly. Climbing above the cloud, the crew leveled off higher than the manual allowed and began the test, slowly bleeding off speed until the stall warning trembled through the controls. It should have given them a comfortable margin, but the ice changed everything. The wings stopped flying almost the same instant, far sooner than anyone expected. The airplane snapped into a roll. Startled by behavior he had never seen, the captain did the one thing that doomed them. He hauled back on the controls instead of pushing forward, deepening the stall rather than escaping it. The Hawker rolled completely over and dropped its nose toward the earth, falling into a flat spin that turned like a leaf as it dropped through the clouds. The recorder captured the 2 men fighting it the whole way down, their voices climbing from disbelief to desperation in the final seconds. A little over a minute after the stall began, the jet struck the desert and was gone. Both pilots died instantly. The investigation was still being written when it happened again. In October of 2025, on a clear, sunny afternoon in Michigan, a Hawker 800 came out of the same kind of maintenance and faced the same required test. The maintenance company handed the crew a list of trained test pilots they could hire, but the visiting crew could not arrange a flight with any of them, so they decided to fly the test themselves, with a 3rd pilot riding along as a passenger. They climbed to altitude, began to slow the airplane, and within moments were calling out that they were in a stall they could not recover from. Witnesses along the interstate watched the jet tumble from a cloudless sky in a flat spin and vanish behind the trees, followed by a column of smoke. All 3 aboard were lost. 2 crashes 20 months apart, on the same model of airplane, performing the same routine test. 5 people dead. Gulfstream had made its customers a promise. Its newest and most expensive business jet would be able to leap into the air from runways barely a mile long, reaching small airports its rivals could not touch. It was a selling point worth a fortune. printed in glossy brochures long before the airplane was finished. It was also, though nobody yet understood it, a promise the laws of physics would not let the airplane keep. 4 men would die discovering that. To take off from such a short runway, the jet needed to become safely airborne at a very low speed. Gulfstream's engineers calculated that speed using formulas borrowed from an older, smaller model in the same family, and they assumed the new jet would behave much like the old one. It did not. When the numbers were finally checked years later, it turned out that the target speed they had chosen was simply impossible. The only way to coax the airplane into the air that slowly was to raise its nose so high on takeoff that the wing met the oncoming air at too steep an angle and stopped flying altogether. In other words, the very technique required to hit the promised speed would stall the airplane just as it left the ground, and the test pilots sent to find that technique had no idea they were chasing something that could not exist. Worse still, a second error hid the danger. Because of a mistaken assumption drawn from flawed textbooks, the engineers had badly misjudged the angle at which the wing would stall while close to the ground. The stall warning system was set to trigger at an angle the airplane could blow straight past, so not only could the jet stall during these takeoffs, it could do so with no warning at all. The controls silent right up until the wing quit. The airplane tried to tell them. Months before the crash, during an earlier test, the same jet had dropped a wing on takeoff and nearly rolled into the ground. It was saved only by the quick hands of the monitoring pilot. The team gathered afterward, talked it over, and decided the pilot had simply pulled up too sharply. They were partly right and dangerously wrong, because what had actually happened was a stall, the first warning of the trap built into their numbers. The testing resumed within minutes. When it happened a second time that spring, it was again brushed aside. There was no formal investigation, and no rule that said the tests had to stop. The reason for the haste sat far above the runway. Gulfstream had promised to have the jet certified and ready for customers by a hard deadline. Missing it would mean costly new requirements, broken promises, and lost money. Managers drove the program at a pace their own engineers warned was unrealistic, telling them it was a risk worth taking because slowing down might make people work less hard. The aviation authorities saw it too, and just 2 days before the crash, they wrote to the company, warning that its schedule had proven impossible to meet. They had no power to force a change. Before Gulfstream even answered the letter, 4 of its people were dead. The test that day was a familiar one. The crew lined up on the runway at Roswell to practice an engine failure at the very moment the jet reached takeoff speed, a maneuver they had flown many times before. The captain eased the nose up, holding it just below the angle where the trouble always seemed to begin, hoping to lift off cleanly and then climb. He never got the chance. An instant after the wheels left the ground, with the nose barely raised, the right wing stalled without a sound. The jet rolled to the right, and though the captain threw his controls hard the other way, nothing answered. A stalled wing cannot be steered. He pushed the nose down to break the stall, exactly as he had been trained, but the miscalibrated warnings had fooled him into thinking a small correction was enough. It was not. The right wing dragged along the runway in a shower of sparks. Fighting to stay in the air, the captain hauled back on the controls to climb, which only drove the wing deeper into the stall. The jet reared up, banked hard, and slammed back down. It careened off the side of the runway on its belly in a cloud of dust and flame. It slid across the desert and struck a low concrete structure, which tore open the fuel tanks and set off an enormous explosion. The captain's final words, caught on the recorder, were an apology to the others. Remarkably, the crash itself was survivable. The impact was not especially violent, and all 4 men lived through it. 3 of them got out of their seats and reached for the cabin door, while the captain struggled to free a trapped leg. But the fire was faster. Before they could open the door, the flames and smoke overwhelmed them, and all 4 were lost just feet from the way out. The investigation led the safety board into unfamiliar territory, since these were not ordinary pilots, and this was no ordinary flight. In the end, it found that a chain of unchecked assumptions, hardened by relentless schedule pressure, had sent the crew out to perform a task that was never possible. Gulfstream rebuilt both its airplane and the way it ran its programs. It raised the takeoff speed to a safe value, found another way to keep its short runway promise, and put firefighters on standby for every dangerous test from then on. But the cruelest part is what the rush actually bought. The jet was certified anyway, almost a year behind the very deadline the company had pushed so hard to meet, and it went on to sell hundreds. The haste saved nothing in the end. It only cost the lives of 4 men who were among the best in the world at a job that asks more courage than almost any other, and who deserved far better than to be sent chasing a number that could not be caught. The DC-8, was one of the proudest possessions of the airline, now known as Air New Zealand. And on this afternoon, it had been pulled from passenger service so that first officers could practice the hardest skill a pilot must master. The man at the controls was a trainee with thousands of hours of experience, but only 21 of them on this new jet. Beside him sat a seasoned instructor whose job was to throw an emergency at him without warning and see how he coped. The emergency they were rehearsing is the one pilot's fear above almost all others: the failure of an engine at the worst possible moment, in the few seconds after the airplane is already committed to flying, but before it has the speed to climb. To simulate that failure, the instructor would simply pull one of the 4 engines back to idle and watch how the student handled the sudden lopsided pull to one side. It was meant to be a controlled exercise, an idled engine and nothing more, easily undone by pushing the lever forward again. But as the jet raced down the runway and the instructor snapped the outer right engine back, something happened that no one in the cockpit understood. Instead of merely going quiet, that engine threw itself into reverse. A jet engine in reverse is a tool for slowing down on the ground after landing, by blasting its thrust forward instead of back. To have it happen on one side of an airplane that is trying to take off is catastrophic. The reversed engine did not simply stop pulling, it actively dragged that side of the airplane backward, and worse, it spoiled the airflow over the wing so that the wing lost its lift. The trainee felt an enormous, baffling drag to the right and a wing that wanted to drop, far more than any dead engine could explain. He stamped in full opposite rudder, and it made no difference. There were no alarms that meant anything to him, no obvious failure, just an airplane that had decided to roll over and would not be talked out of it. In the right seat, the instructor must have realized his mistake and tried to stow the reverser, but there was no time. Seconds after leaving the ground, banked steeply to the right, the wingtip caught the grass beside the runway. The jet pivoted around it, slammed its nose into the earth and broke apart, the cockpit shearing away and sliding upside down while the rest cartwheeled across a taxiway and burst into flame. Of the 5 pilots aboard, 3 survived with serious injuries. The instructor and the flight engineer did not. What investigators uncovered was a subtle, frightening flaw. To work out how the engine had reversed, they turned to the pilots who watched from a nearby building, several of them aviation professionals, who swore they saw the reverser open before the crash. Acting on that, the manufacturer ran the numbers and found that a reversed engine on takeoff would rob the airplane of control at a speed far higher than the jet ever reached. The pilots had been doomed the instant it deployed, but how had it deployed at all? The answer lay in the design of the throttles. Hinged to the top of each power lever was a small handle for the reverser, and engineers discovered that if a pilot yanked the power lever back fast enough, the momentum alone could fling that little handle up into the reverse position all by itself. No one had ever intended such a thing to be possible, yet it was, and the faster you moved, the easier it happened. Most chilling of all, this exact thing had nearly occurred once before, with the very same instructor, on an earlier training flight. That time the airplane was going fast enough, and he reacted quickly enough that they recovered with only a frightening wobble. But nobody reported it. No record was made. The manufacturer was never told, and so the trap stayed armed, waiting. When it sprang a second time, lower and slower, 2 men paid for the silence with their lives. That, in the end, is the lesson this old and half-forgotten crash still carries. The danger was real, and it was knowable, and a single honest report after the first near miss would almost certainly have saved them. Out of it came a simple and powerful principle that runs through all of modern aviation. Share every experience and report every incident, however small it seems, because the close call you shrug off today is the accident that kills someone tomorrow. When rescue boats reached the wreckage off the French coast, there was almost nothing left to find. The Airbus had hit the Mediterranean at such speed that it simply came apart, and only light debris remained bobbing on the surface. The largest piece was the tail, floating alone in the swell, freshly painted in the deep blue and white of Air New Zealand. That paint was only 3 days old, and in a way that no one could have guessed, it was the paint that had killed them. The airplane was an Airbus A320, and on the 27th of November 2008, it was about to change hands. For 2 years, it had flown holidaymakers around the Mediterranean for a German charter airline. Now its lease was up, and it was being returned to its owner, Air New Zealand. Before taking it back, the owner wanted a check flight, a chance to put the airplane through its paces, and confirm that every system worked as it should. 7 people boarded for that flight. 2 were the German crew, 2 were senior pilots and engineers from New Zealand, and the rest were along for the ride. Not one of them was a trained test pilot, though the flight they were about to attempt was very much a test. To understand what went wrong, you have to go back 3 days, to the hangar where the airplane was repainted in its new colors. Painting a jet is delicate work. and the proper procedure called for the most sensitive parts to be carefully covered, and for any final cleaning to be done gently by hand. But the schedule was tight, and wiping down an entire airliner by hand is slow. So the painting crew did something faster. They rinsed the airplane with a fire hose. What they did not appreciate was that 3 small vanes on the nose of the aircraft were not built to withstand that. These were the angle of attack sensors, little blades that swivel in the airflow to tell the airplane's computers how steeply the wing is meeting the oncoming air. It is one of the most important measurements in all of flight, because it is the number that warns of a stall. The covers that should have protected them were not all in place. The powerful jet of water forced its way deep inside 2 of the 3, where it pooled and sat hidden for 3 days. The water did nothing at all until the airplane climbed high on the day of the flight, where the air is bitterly cold. There it froze, locking 2 of the 3 sensors solid at a single fixed reading. Now came the cruel twist. When the airplane's computers noticed that one sensor disagreed with the other 2, they assumed the lone dissenter was the broken one and ignored it. In truth, it was the only one still telling the truth. From that moment, the system that was supposed to prevent a stall was quietly running on frozen, false information. The crew had no idea. They worked their way down a checklist of tests, but the day had gone wrong from the start. They had filed their paperwork incorrectly, so air traffic control would not give them the clear airspace they needed. They fell behind, improvising, squeezing the checks in wherever they could. One test in particular was meant to be done at 14,000 feet, with plenty of room beneath them. It was the test of the very stall protection that the frozen sensors had already disabled. By the time they got to it, rushed and out of sequence, they were down at just 3,000 feet. No careful test pilot would ever have attempted it that low. They did it anyway. The captain slowed the airplane and raised its nose, waiting for the automatic protection to step in and stop the nose from rising any further. It never came. The frozen sensors told the computers everything was fine, and the warning markers on his display kept sliding away ahead of him. So the danger never showed. He slowed and slowed, until the wing finally gave up, and the airplane stalled, just 3,000 feet above the sea. What followed was a desperate scramble in a machine that had stopped behaving the way they expected. The stall threw the airplane into a roll. Pinned between full power and a stubborn nose-high trim, the airplane reared into a steep climb. It lost its speed a second time and stalled again. There was no height left to recover. Just over a minute after the first sign of trouble, the A320 plunged into the Mediterranean, and all 7 aboard were lost. The chain of events was so strange that it took investigators nearly 3 years to lay it all out, from the fire hose to the frozen sensors to the final dive. But the hardest questions were not about the airplane. They were about the people. Every pilot aboard was a veteran with more than 10,000 hours. They understood the aircraft. They had the skill to plan the flight sensibly. And yet, they tested a safety system at an altitude where they could not survive its failure, with no plan for what to do if it did fail, because deep down they did not really believe it would. They had come to treat the check as a list of boxes to tick, not a genuine test, and that quiet complacency cost them everything. 4 young pilots were learning to fly. They were students in an airline's training program, taking turns at the controls of an Airbus A320 over Estonia. Again and again, they practiced the most basic skill there is, taking off and landing on the same runway. Watching over them sat a veteran instructor with 24,000 hours behind him, and a safety pilot and an aviation inspector rode along as well. 7 people in all, on what should have been the most routine flight imaginable. It would become one of the most harrowing few minutes in the history of the airplane. The trouble began as a small annoyance. Every so often, a caution message blinked onto the screen, warning of a fault in one of the flight control computers. The fix was simple: switch the computer off and on again, and the message would vanish. The crew had no reason to worry, because the A320 is built with extraordinary redundancy. To lose control of the elevators, the surfaces that raise and lower the nose, 4 separate computers would all have to fail one after another. That is supposed to be all but impossible. This time it happened anyway. Each time the instructor took the controls for a touch and go, he held a wheel in the cockpit to keep the airplane trimmed for takeoff. Deep inside the tail, a tiny part was supposed to tell the computers that a human had taken charge. But that part had been greased with the wrong oil, twice as thick as it should have been, and it kept sticking. So instead of understanding that the pilot was in command, the computers decided their own commands were failing, and they began to quit. First one shut down, then a second. When 2 backup computers stepped in, a freak piece of timing during a bounced landing fooled them both into thinking a sensor had failed, and they shut down too. In the space of a few seconds, all 4 were gone, and the elevators locked rigid. At that instant, a student was trying to lift the nose off the runway, and nothing happened. The instructor took over and pulled back, and still nothing happened, because the controls he was using no longer did anything. With the nose refusing to rise, the airplane sank back down and struck the runway on its engines, scraping along in a shower of sparks before staggering back into the air. What followed was a violent fight for survival. The jet pitched up steeply on its own, then plunged into a dive toward the ground, pulling out at less than 600 feet as alarms screamed from every direction. One engine was now on fire. The flaps had jammed. Warning after warning piled on top of one another until the cockpit was a wall of noise. The only thing the instructor had left was the manual trim wheel, a backup connected to the tail by cables rather than computers, and the rudder. With these crude tools, he slowly wrestled the bucking airplane into something like level flight. He turned back toward the airport, lining up for the runway. When the safety pilot suggested shutting down the burning engine, the instructor refused. As long as it still made thrust, he reasoned, he needed it. It was a decision that saved them. Moments later, that engine died on its own, and then the second engine failed as well. The airplane lost electrical power, and the screens went dark. For a few seconds, it became a glider, sinking toward a runway it might not reach. A small turbine dropped automatically from the belly to restore a trickle of power, and some controls flickered back to life. Bleeding off every last knot of speed, the instructor stretched the airplane's glide as far as it would go. It touched down hard in the snow, just short of the runway, tires bursting as it skidded across the asphalt and slewed to a stop. Fire trucks rushed in and smothered it in foam. And then, one by one, all 7 people aboard climbed down the escape slides and walked away into the gray afternoon. 2 were slightly hurt. Not one was killed. When investigators arrived, they expected to find a broken airplane. Instead, they found that, until the moment it slammed onto the runway, nothing had been wrong with it at all. Every control, every computer had been working exactly as designed. The entire catastrophe had grown from a single drop of the wrong oil on a part most engineers will never even see, magnified by a chain of computer logic so improbable it may never happen again. The airplane had been built with layer upon layer of protection, and on that afternoon, every single layer fell. What remained was the oldest safeguard of all, a human being with the skill and nerve to fly a crippled machine by hand when all its brilliance had failed. That is why, of all the stories in this video, this is the one where everyone went home. Look back across these stories, and something quietly remarkable stands out. In almost none of them did the airplane truly fail. The Hawkers flew exactly as built. The Gulfstream was sound. The Airbus over the Mediterranean had nothing wrong with it until the moment it struck the water. The same was true of the jet over Estonia, and of the one that vanished into a mountain in Indonesia. Again and again, investigators tore through the wreckage expecting to find a broken machine, and again they found something harder to fix. They found us. That is the strange truth at the center of this video. The most dangerous part of testing an airplane is rarely the airplane. It is the human standing at the edge of what is known, deciding how far to push and when to stop. And in story after story, the same small failings appear, wearing different clothes, a schedule that mattered more than a warning, a check treated as a box to tick, a veteran so sure of his skill that he flew a test he could not survive, a crew so eager to impress their customers that they argued with the machine instead of listening to it. None of these people were reckless fools. They were experienced, capable, and confident. And that confidence was exactly the trap. Yet the human factor cuts both ways, and it would be wrong to end only on our failures. The same fragile and fallible people who walked into these tragedies are also the ones who flew a crippled jet by hand over Estonia, when every computer had quit, and brought 7 souls back to Earth alive. When all the engineering in the world has been spent, the last thing standing between a crew and disaster is a human being with the nerve to rise to the moment. We are the weakness. We are also the final defense. It is worth remembering who these people were. They were not passengers who simply bought a ticket. They were the test pilots, the instructors, the engineers who go first into the unknown so the rest of us never have to. Their job is to find the edge of an airplane's ability, and finding an edge sometimes means falling off it. They knew the risk, and they took it anyway, because someone has to, and because the alternative is to learn these lessons with a cabin full of ordinary travelers instead. And that is the quiet gift they leave behind. Almost every line in the thick book of flight testing was written after a day like the ones in this film. The locks that now stop a control from moving at the wrong moment. The rules about who may fly a test and how. The training that turns panic into procedure. The simple, hard-won wisdom that a strange warning deserves respect, not an off switch. Each of these protections exists because someone once paid for it. The next time you settle into your seat and feel the airplane lift cleanly into the sky, know that its safety was bought in part by people who flew the dangerous version of that same flight so you would never have to. So we end where we began, at the edge of what machines can do and people can endure. Pushing that edge will always carry risk. As long as humans build machines, humans will be the ones who test them, with all the courage and all the frailty that implies. The least we can do is remember their names, learn what they taught us, and never again make them teach the same lesson twice. If you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe.